Sam, perhaps if I could start by asking you, you've talked about ethnography this afternoon, and I've talked about using experiments. Is there anything in the kinds of things I've been discussing that that strike you as something you could potentially use, or what might be the drawbacks of doing that?
Well, I think the thing that immediately stood out to me was, whilst we're sometimes using a slightly different language, I think the big themes about how we interpret data, the problems we face are common. So I think sometimes a lot of the literature, I always like the term Phil Strong used about intergalactic paradigm mongering, about setting up these two kind of camps. I think it's as a bit of a myth. There are things that both we're seeking to achieve, but we're united by having to think hard about how we go about things and the advantages and disadvantages to every method. So some of the language you used really stood out to me, the cleanliness of an approach. But in terms of, I think there's no real clash between them, and I saw plenty of synergies as well. I mean, is that fair?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, and I also think that we tend to think in polarities. We tend to think that if you've got a quantitative measure, then that's all fine, and you know exactly what it means, but it can only tell you about the hypothesis you had beforehand. Whereas if you have a qualitative measure, you'll know exactly what it means, and you'll immediately be inside your participant's head, but you can't test an a priori hypothesis with it. And I don't really think any of that's true. As researchers, we're always kind of improvising. We're always asking ourselves the question, okay, I've made these observations somehow or other. What do they mean? How do they bear on my understanding of the situation? What observations do I need to make next? And in a way, you're always kind of going around the same iteration. And I think really, quantitative or qualitative, or however you do it, every way you do it will have some limitations, but also be informative somehow.
There was one particular aspect, something that seemed so central to ethnography, but didn't really feature in the way you articulated some of your approach, is the role of the researcher. And there's so much, in the literature talks about finding a role, blending in, having access, rapport, those kind of things. Is that something that worries or?
I think it's a huge issue in experimental approaches, perhaps for rather different reasons. So I've actually been always quite attracted to kind of approaches that put me in the background, like simple observational studies, literally standing on street corners and counting passers-by. And I think a lot of that's to do with personality, actually. Something we might talk about later is choosing a method that suits your personality, because I'm not somebody who finds it very easy to sort of strike up conversations with new people and immediately become self-disclosing and find a role. I find that very awkward. But actually, for many types of experiments where you're going to recruit people, you want them to take part, you want them to understand what you're doing, rapport is just as important, actually. You can make a huge difference to the outcome by the way you are with them, and understanding what you're doing and why you're doing it and what they have to do and what the consequences for them will be. Putting them at their ease is actually enormously important. So all of those issues sort of loom large. I would say the difference, in a way, is that it's much easier to explain an experimental study to your participants, in a way, because it's a limited time thing, your role is defined, and partly you can kind of adopt something of the cachet of the natural sciences. You say, I'm coming along, we're doing this experiment, it will take you 90 minutes. That's kind of a relatively easy sell, whereas I'm going to be living in your village for a few months. You'll see me around walking my dogs, I'd like to chat to you. So in a way, that there is a kind of bravery about entering the more open-ended fieldwork, and I think I've partly always hidden behind having relatively defined roles. I'm here for the afternoon. I'm running this session in your community centre. I'll be gone at 4 o'clock. It's a bit easier, actually.
You're talking about how you feel about doing research, and that's, one of the things that makes me feel slightly uncomfortable about doing ethnography is sometimes you're there, you're resident, but you're under pressure as well to collect all this data in this time frame. And it means you have to, put yourself about a bit in order to broker those kind of relationships, to get access, to knock on people's doors, to pick up the phone, to email people, so that you can just meet as many people and work towards collecting that kind of knowledge. And that's one of the things that I've felt most uncomfortable, I suppose, in doing ethnographic fieldwork. And I always loved one of the studies where a really tall researcher was researching primary school kids, and he hid in the Wendy house in order to just kind of disguise his physical presence and not to interfere with the social relations in the classroom. And you can't necessarily just hide, you have to be out and about if you're doing ethnography in a village. And I did go into the preschool in one Norfolk village I researched. And there was a Wendy house. I remember getting quite excited because I read about the Wendy house as being used as a research tool. It was just interesting hearing and interacting and the various props I suppose people have used in terms of to find a role, to hide, dogs to use to break a rapport. Are there props that you've used or?
Well, in a way, I think some of these. I've been talking about some sort of simple economic games like the ultimatum game and the trust game, and in a way, one way you could think about those is as props, right? People might use those for different reasons. Some people will be testing a hypothesis, but they're a kind of icebreaker actually. If you could say, we're going to do this thing, it's going to take a couple of hours, we're all going to get together in some location, there'll be a fun element and people will take prizes away. That actually could be a sort of icebreaker. So one rather alternative way of thinking about it would be it's something to start from. This is something you could do that sort of establishes you as a researcher who has a protocol, has some ideas to do, makes clear to people that they can do what they like, it's non-judgmental, there are no consequences from their participation, and they may come and talk to you afterwards. They may say, that was weird, why did you do that? And actually it may generate a more qualitative set of relationships afterwards. Now, in my own work that hasn't really happened, in all honesty, but I could see that it could, and that might be a way you would use it. So funnily enough, having those kind of standardized protocols could be a kind of prop, and it could be a way of presenting yourself as a researcher and showing that the things you do are harmless and so on. And it might actually segue into different kinds of interaction, which would be interesting.
One of the things the literature around ethnography really talks about is gatekeepers who've been really, really key in terms of bringing you up to date when you've been away for a minute. So I can remember the name of my gatekeeper when I did my PhD field research. I was researching 11-year-old kids, but he would just come and chat to me as soon as I was back in the classroom and tell me what occurred. And there was craze for yo-yos that comes around every once in a while, and he was selling yo-yos in school. I got my yo-yo from him. Do you have gatekeepers in the same kind of sense?
So it depends what kind of experiment you're doing. So I've done experiments with just things like dropping shopping on a street corner and seeing who helped, and there's no gatekeeping, and that really is sort of get in, get out. In fact, I didn't even do it myself. I had various research assistants because I wanted to vary the gender of the dropper and so on. So I had a whole series of people who would do it in different places. So there, in a way, it's all unmediated. But if you're going to do the kind of experiments that involve recruiting people and having them come, then it's crucial to get. You can't just sort of randomly wait on street corners and say, do you want to come in here and do an experiment for an hour? Or not easily, anyway. You can try, but you might get some strange reactions. So there, it's important to plug into social networks that might exist, a community centre, a church or something. That raises its own problems, right? Because the people who go to the community centre or go to the church are probably not a random sample of your population, right? So if you say, I'm going to make some generalisation about population A from these 24 people in the village hall, you have to ask yourself, to what extent do those 24 represent the people who haven't come? So that's a really interesting question. I've done a lot of experiments in people's homes, which is very laborious. So we deliver questionnaires or packs saying, would you like to take part in this? And because these are multiplayer games, player A has to say, I'd do this, and then player B is someone else, and they do that in response. We have to cycle around, right? So we know where the addresses are, so we cycle around. This other person has done this, and then we cycle back, which is quite weird, but it's very important to think about, who's going to come? How are they going to find out about this? And what kind of people are going to volunteer if you're doing any kind of experiment that has a self-selection component? So in a way, all of those problems you have in ethnography don't go away. That's the bad news. Research is just as complex as ever. So any idea that by adopting these sort of standardized protocols, all of my problems just melt away and it's fine, I just do this and there's my data, bang, bang, I've done a quantitative analysis. There's still a lot of difficult stuff to work out, and it relies on your social skills and your ingenuity, and it's an improvised process. Again, to come back to the difference between ethnography and experiments, you might think, well, experiments are all idealized, you follow a standardized protocol, that's it, you're done. Whereas ethnography is this sort of difficult, arduous, slightly mysterious process. Well, it's a difficult, arduous process either way, and it's full of kind of little qualitative decisions you make that probably affect your results, in all honesty. So you're not freed from any of the complexities of research, whichever way you do it, I think.
You talking about the dilemmas of doing research in people's homes, it's kind of reminded me about some of the decisions I've had to make in past research on villages. For example, I'm not religious, so I didn't attend any of the ceremonies or the services in the church because I felt that would be almost sort of faking it too far.
Sure.
And I did really try to get hold of the vicar. I could not get hold of the vicar at all. He was shared amongst 7 churches, and I was just unable to access him. But it does make you think about where's legitimate to conduct your research. And I did, on invitation, visit people's homes a lot. And whilst we mentioned dogs, and I get on well with dogs, but I don't like cats, and I've been sat on by so many cats whilst doing kind of interviews.
They know who are researchers and who are not, and they just go straight for
it. I mean, in a public space, you can easily do the dropping experiment, or you can count the footfall.
Yeah.
Are there places that you wouldn't consider legitimate or interesting, or?
Well, so I think that you raise perhaps the more general issue of ethics, right? And I mean, in a way, experiments involve subjecting people to some kind of standardized measurement at the very least, and possibly manipulating at least their informational state, or maybe manipulating something else about them. So there's a broader question of to what extent do people need to know what your hypothesis is, to what extent do people need to know why you're doing this, and to what extent do people really need to know the true nature of the procedure, right? So in a way, those are the issues that loom largest for me. Clearly, if you had to say, I'm doing this game, it's called the trust game, and it works out how much people trust each other, and we found that it varies from neighbourhood to neighbourhood, and this particular neighbourhood, we don't think it will be very high. I mean, your experiment is lost at that point. Besides which, your participants' eyes glaze over as well. So you've got to think, what's an acceptable way of saying, I'm just doing something here. There's no right or wrong answer. You can do what you like. But actually, I'm not really going to tell you quite what it's about. That's a sort of ethically difficult thing. And in a way, I imagine will be exacerbated as you get to know people better. Because you sort of have to give a fuller account of yourself in a way. Now, I mean, economists are very keen on the fact that you have to incentivize all kinds of decisions with real money. They believe that really shows what people's preferences are, as opposed to things they might say because they feel them to be socially desirable. But actually, I find incentivization with money has another benefit, though this is a difficult area, which is that at least I can say you'll get £5 out of this. You've got a spare hour, come down, you'll get some money out of it. And that, in a way, gives people a kind of reason for participating, and you don't feel you have to say, and we're doing this because in the long run the community might benefit if we can understand the determinants of trust a bit more, which is A, possibly not true, and B, kind of wordy and worthy. But if you say, well, look, come along, there'll be no harm and you'll get a few quid, people will do that. And so it's actually a lubricating factor. But set against that, if the financial stakes start to be too big, then that's an ethical risk, because people might do things that they don't really want to do, but they're desperate for money, and so that's...
It's a really tricky one, and it's one I feel sort of ambiguous about, and I can see the benefits the way you've articulated it there, but I feel quite uncomfortable in terms of employing it in any field research I've done. But you still want to be respectful of people's time. Yeah. So I remember negotiating access to one a rural village school, and it just so happened that they were literally that September moving to a new building. And with everything that was going on, there's no way I could have possibly imposed, a field researcher on top of, that move. So obviously I had to, withdraw and find a different school. But you still want to establish your legitimacy and that you are not interfering or being useful. So you're not just hiding in the Wendy house. But I remember at the end of term, there's always lots going on in preparation for next year. And the school I was in, they were preparing for a new build to be built over the summer. So there was just a lot of physical furniture to be moved. So I spent almost a week moving, helping them, move furniture. But that gives you opportunities to have those kind of conversations you just do, informally. So the way Burgess talks about it as a conversation with a purpose, you end up chatting. So, you're making yourself useful, but at the same time, the conversation is kind of ongoing. I've never used financial incentives in the same way that perhaps you have in your research.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a difficult area. Partly, it's actually a social icebreaker, right? Because money is something that we all know about. So it's a way of engaging people in a kind of conversation, I suppose. But something I wanted to ask you was, you talk very interestingly about the sort of spirit of ethnography being open-ended and exploratory. And I kind of stressed what experiments give you is sort of standardized measurement that we can use an established protocol and say, well, if you do it under these circumstances, these are the results. And I just wondered, how can those two things ever be reconciled? If we want to be exploratory, we also want to have things that we can compare with other researchers or our own past research or our own future research. How do we do that? And is that the sort of heart of the tension between these two methods, that the open-endedness that you're describing and the kind of repeatability that I'm describing, can they be sort of brought together in any way?
Oh, it's a massive question. I don't think we're going to be able to cover it.
No, sure.
I think Well, first of all, there are a couple of things. Finding the field is the way I've kind of articulated it in some of the publications I've done with Chris Pohl. And that means reading around a field to work out what questions other people have asked, what are relevant concerns, what are core concerns, because you don't want to reinvent the wheel in that sense. But at the same time, once you're in the field, I think that exploratory spirit, that's one of the core advantages to ethnography is that you might discover something new or something you hadn't thought about. And that's too much of an advantage I think, to restrict or to limit. So people use unstructured interviewing, not because they can't be bothered to write an interview schedule, but it's because they're hoping something new will come up and they're able to follow that up. So that's, it's a strategic weapon, if you like, or device to hopefully find something new. So that's, to me, the massive advantage of it. But of course, huge problems for repeat studies, huge dilemmas there.
And I guess in a way, huge problems for generalisation. So what does this add up to? If we're thinking about larger scale generalisations about particular types of social processes that might be going on, but that, as you say, is a broader issue. I suppose from the way I've thought about it, I've often done things where there's been a series of experiments which have been sort of exploratory, if that makes sense. So I've seen, well, I'll do this trust game or something. Oh, well, that seemed to be the results of the trust game. Now what if I vary it? Maybe I'll try making it a local charity. I'll try making it, a fund in a working man's club. Right, and this is exploratory because it's stimulated by observations you've made. But so as it were, within each experiment there's a standardised protocol. But at the end of each one you scratch your head and say, well, what do I think is going on? I'll try another one. And for me that kind of slightly retains the exploratory characteristic you're talking about, but with perhaps the sort of more standardised things that I'm more comfortable with. And I think another thing you can usefully do is say, well, blogs has come up with this paradigm, so I'll do blogs as measure. But I'll do some other things as well. Blogs as measure seem to tell me that this was a very trusting community. But actually when I do this other thing, it doesn't look that way. So maybe there's something interesting going on here, that trust is multifaceted or whatever. So in a way the exploratory potential is there. But in the process you're incidentally generating data on blogs as measure done in many different communities, and someone else might pull that in a different way. So in a way trying to keep one eye to the left on comparability with other studies, whilst the right eye in your own field being inspired by the exploratory possibilities.
Well, to follow up on that, something you said earlier about when you started your studies in, was it 2009? And then you've written the book it's just kind of come out. At what point did you think that all that data across the years, now is the time to write a book? Is it more than the sum of its parts?
Yes, and the idea of writing the book came very late in the day. In fact, I did an observational study of children's play initially, like street play. And then I thought, this is quite interesting, and I've learned a lot about these two neighbourhoods. And then I thought, well, actually, I could do these economic games. And then we did some drop shopping stuff. And I thought, well, that's sort of interesting, because the drop shopping stuff told us different things than the economic games. Okay. So we put that in the paper. And then a student comes along and says, I need a project. And I say, well, I don't know what you could do your fieldwork, but I already know about this place. So you could do that. And then before you know it, you've sort of got a whole series of things. And I wonder if these experimental measures, for many purposes, become more interesting, not in isolation, but as different observations about the same study population that you can begin to add up. I think there's two ways you could use them. You could either have the same measures in many populations, then you can maybe generalise about people more generally, what do they do in the situation? Or you can have many methods from one place, and then you can say, well, these different methods, each of them seem to tell us a different thing. And I guess the latter is more the ethnographic imagination, and the former is the sort of standard cross-cultural study. But in a way, maybe you can do a bit of both. I
think that really echoes the argument I made earlier about participant observation being at the core of ethnography. But it's really done on its own. You've usually got other things around it. So when I've done research in villages, there's often been a data set about the village that is already there. Either someone local has done a piece of research. One village was literally on the cusp of doing a village survey. So of course I'm interested in what they find. So you end up picking up those bits of data that already exist, as well as any documents or archives. School logs, for example, I've discovered in one particular village. So all of those sit round a study. But it was interesting you said about cross-cultural studies as well, that approach. And perhaps that's something maybe ethnographers don't do so as well. They tend to talk about, here is my ethnography, rather than perhaps, here's an ethnography that I did earlier that makes me think a little bit more about this core one. And I think that's something I'd be more receptive to see in future ethnographic work, and I'm trying to do in my own work, because sometimes that comparison gives you real analytic purchase.
Yeah, absolutely. So a question I'd like to ask you, actually, I suppose, is an advantage of the kind of work I've been doing, where I've been using experimental methods, just from a researcher point of view, is I sort of know when I'm done. Maybe not, I'll never know if the whole project's done, or maybe it will never be done, but I know when a chunk is done. Because I think, well, what I decided to go and do the dictator game in this neighbourhood and get at least 100 people, so I had a reasonable sample. And I sort of know when I've done that. Now, of course, you could make a different decision about what the unit is, but having decided the unit is, you know when it's done. And I suppose, in a way, I have a sort of terror that a more classically participant orientation-driven ethnography, I would never know when it was done. I wouldn't even know when I was doing it. I like my life to be sort of simple and compartmentalised, and I wonder how you deal with that.
It's really difficult, and you read some of the literature, and they talk about wait until your concepts that you're refining in the field, and until you've exhausted any refinement. But when does that happen?
Yeah.
Is there a moment you just wake up? My concepts are exhausted. I just don't think it happens.
Feel like that.
And I like the way Delamont kind of said it. It's more like when the researcher is exhausted, that's the time to kind of come out. So you don't have that. It's not black and white. It is really, really unclear. Often, if you're doing funded research, there's physically you can't spend more time there. So that's a time to leave. Hopefully, if you're looking to explore a context of a case study, so say a village, you'd want to speak to the core people there, and you think once you've got a sense of what's going on, perhaps that might be a time to feel satisfied you had a grasp of what's going on. But it's difficult to know in any kind of certain sense that yes, I now have insight. I can write up my findings. And a difficult thing is sometimes things only make sense after you've come out of the field and had a good think about it. The things you saw at the time and perhaps read in one way didn't actually translate what they really meant later on. So I remember hearing some nicknames for one student when I was doing my PhD research, and at the time I was thinking, there's just racism in the school, this is outrageous, this is really, really shocking, and it was all in my field notes at the time. But after a while, I'd been there for a while and worked it out. It wasn't. It was, it was just some of the nicknames they have within the group, and it wasn't anything to do with that at all. So there were other complexities between the pupils who really were actually clashes, but it wasn't about race at all. So analysis, I think, isn't something that just happens when you leave the field. It's something you're doing at the time, and perhaps it comes back to the structured and semi-structured nature of field research. But yeah, when to leave the field, there is no answer. It's really, really difficult.
Reflecting back on your initial point about personality and researchers' personality and how much sort of ambiguity you can live with or not live with, or what suits you best. And I think that's not often talked about, but that's really interesting.
I think that's very interesting, and I think the choice to be a social scientist rather than physicist is driven by your personality. So within social science, the kinds of things that will attract you is also driven that way, and we have to be honest about that. One imagines it's very high-level intellectual concerns that drive your choice of method, but it's also, what do I feel comfortable doing? What kind of person am I? The biggest challenge in my academic career has been finding what I'm good at. Finding what I like doing. I knew that I was intellectually bright in the sense that I could read papers and understand what they were talking about. But what do I feel comfortable doing? My first field project was in Nigeria, was sort of more classically ethnographic, and I found it excruciating. I have to sit with men in pubs for hours, which is something I never do. It's not the kind of thing I do. And so discovering other things I could do that sort of suited my temperament. In a way, this project of mine we've been discussing has been that sort of attempt to find a way of studying a working class neighbourhood of Newcastle that didn't involve going to working men's clubs and having to sit there for hours, because I would be terrible at it, and it's just, so you have to find something that's right for you.
And I know, Sam, on one of your slides you said pluralism of methods, but not methodological pluralism. Do you think that methodological pluralism has its place?
I remember really celebrating eclectic research styles when I was a postgraduate. I was really, really swung on that. And there was the sort of postmodern turn at the same time. So people like Ian Stronach were writing poetry as a means to represent ethnography. And it seemed, so exciting and so radical and new. But actually, I think now I'm just interested in it being done well. So what I'm interested in Daniel's work is because he's thinking hard about it. And does it unlock a place? So to me, it's good research, because it answers those kind of questions. It's not just a free-for-all, or it's not unprincipled. It's not just because you woke up on a Wednesday and thought, I'll do that. So I think it's not anything goes, I suppose, just a kind of pluralism, anything goes. It's not that. it's principled.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think it's not anything goes. There's another danger that goes with professionalisation of research and standards imposed by peer review and stuff, which are very admirable in lots of ways, is that a kind of lack of critical thinking tends to creep in, and people say, oh, well, everyone just does the World Values Survey Trust module. So we did the World Values Survey. But what does it mean? But well, that's what everyone does. So to get it published, we have to have done that, or whatever it might be. So I think there's a danger if you sort of make it up in a completely unprincipled way as you go along. But there's also a danger if you say, well, the people in my field do this measure, so I just do this measure. That's also not very satisfactory. So I think you need to be constantly your own harshest critic and say, why am I doing this? What might it mean? How could I do it better? Could I complement it another way with other kinds of data? Very often the research we most admire does a particular thing that's very innovative, and then you get a load of sort of second-rate studies that come in and just sort of do that same thing again because someone else did it, without really recreating the thought process that went into doing that method, so that they reproduce the form without the kind of thought process behind it.
Does that halfway answer your question?
I'm fairly firm in my belief that you can, if you can justify it, epistemologically, and from an ontological perspective, I don't have an issue with that at all, taking a pragmatic view. But if you go back to sort of the classic paradigm war perspective, you have to be one or the other. You can't mix them both. Whereas I think practically today, if you've got a real question to answer, you have to use both.
I agree. I mean, so the only thing I would say in favour of the paradigm war perspective, which generally I deplore, is you have to be clear what your question is, and you have to understand that you can't answer a question about chalk with an answer about cheese, and in a way. I mean, I don't believe in those paradigms, and I'm a pragmatist and a pluralist, very definitely. But it is important to have very clearly in mind what is the question I'm trying to answer, and is my method fitted to that question, or is my method actually doing something different? So in a way, that clarity about what am I trying to do, and then what are the means available to me to do it is there. But within that, I think you can be a pragmatist and you can be a pluralist, absolutely. And
you're articulating, can I defend why I did what I did? So validity, I think, is important for both approaches. So defensibility, that's the phrase I always use to students at Durham. Give an account of why you did what you did. So. Yeah.